Hi, my name is Jayreid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and today I would like to talk about restoring the capacity for flow states after narcissistic abuse. So in the 1990s, a sociologist from the University of Chicago posed the question of what leads to people's happiness in life. It was a big, kind of cool question, and he determined that happiness or sort of satisfaction in life was most correlated with the frequency of states people found themselves where they were immersed in the pursuit of a goal that was just sort of on the outer edge of their skill set level as they perceived that to be, where there was immediate feedback on their progress towards that goal or challenge, and where once sufficiently engaged in these pursuits towards these goals, there could be the experience of sort of time falling away and having a singular focus on each specific task needed to be done in progression towards the goal. He called this state flow and emphasized how it affords an orderly state in one's consciousness, because sort of all the background noise kind of goes to the wayside and the individual gets to be supremely focused and really immersed in this pursuit that they are in. So like, for an example, a state of flow is not just for like artists or professional athletes or the like. It can be found in sort of everyday life. So let's say one is a bit of a hobbyist in terms of building birdhouses, and they find a birdhouse, say in a magazine, that's a bit, it's quite, seems sophisticated, but they believe that if they stretch themselves, they could probably build that. And so there'll be a slight tinge of sort of, am I up to the task, but also sort of a motivation to stretch oneself to indeed be able to build the birdhouse and do all the subtasks required to do leading up to the completion of the birdhouse. And so as one starts to get into it, the mind may be flitting about a bit, but with traction and sort of sustained concentration on the task, the state of flow may very well emerge, where one is just finds oneself kind of in that state of focus on, say, sanding this piece of wood, and then taking the other pieces of wood and carefully nailing them together, then say sanding and varnishing and painting it, and then deciding where to hang it up. All being very consuming tasks as they're occurring, because one is sort of in that state of flow in pursuit of the completion of the building of this birdhouse. And this professor's name was Csikszentmihalyi, and I'll put the link in the description below. He's written a couple books on, one's I think called Flow, and the other's Finding Flow in Everyday Things or Everyday Matters. A really lucid writer, and I'd recommend his books to anyone interested. And one, and I think important way he contrasted the state of flow is something he called psychic entropy. And, like in thermodynamics and science, the entropy, the state of entropy, is often defined as an unpredictable state that gradually declines into disorder. And what Csikszentmihalyi is sort of saying is that if we're not oriented towards a goal and kind of marshaling our resources towards it, we are at risk of sort of falling into the psychic state of sort of disarray that may ensue. That there's a sort of sense of strength and activity that comes in the pursuit of a goal, and in the absence of that, this sort of entropic state can emerge. There's that old saying that nature abhors a vacuum. And so when there is a sort of vacuum, it can get filled with things that sort of contribute more to this, the sort of state of disarray or disorder in consciousness, rather than the kind of more cohered singular-mindedness of the flow state. And I wanted to bring up this state of flow today because, in these videos I've paid a lot of attention to the ways one can sort of be traumatized and have to survive the traumas and the necessary adaptations that are made, and on strategies of how to directly cope with the vestiges of having to survive such ordeals. I think that the question can still remain of how to structure one's experience in the day-to-day moments one has after survival of narcissistic abuse or any sort of trauma. I think that concepts such as flow can be very important to kind of like make use of with, I think, an included understanding of like what the specific challenges in doing so could be for the survivor of narcissistic abuse. And that's really what I want to focus on today. I'd like to discuss ways that both aims, that of achieving the flow state and of kind of paying attention to what needs attending to in terms of recovery from the traumatic sequelae of narcissistic abuse, how both those aims can kind of be respected and even complement one another in the process, I would say, recovery, but also in just leading a life that feels valuable from within. So as I mentioned before, the real hallmark of the kind of parameters of a task that can set oneself up for achieving this state of flow is that the perceived challenge sits just on the outer edge of one's perceived sort of skill set. And I think it's probably maybe easy to see how adaptations often necessary to survive narcissistic abuse could thwart this process of establishing flow in this regard. So like having to believe that one is defective, physically disgusting, or like one mistake away from complete ruin can all make these steps of finding a suitable goal that is sort of at the outer edge of one's skill set feel extremely fraught and even potentially re-traumatizing in certain scenarios to a degree. So one very, I think, important way that needing to adopt these kinds of beliefs about oneself can interfere with establishing these states of flow is that it can make it hard to take an accurate inventory of one's own skill set and appropriately gauge the degree of difficulty of the challenge. I think in these cases where these beliefs of being defective, etc., are operative, that the result can often be that one ends up underestimating one's skills. And again, this is sort of a practice that was required for survival, as we've talked before. Possession of one's knowledge of their strengths can very well pose a grave threat if the narcissistic individual perceives the survivor to be doing that. So the practice of sort of disavowing the knowledge of the skills one possess would have likely been a necessary tactic to hone and practice. So, but as a result, as we're talking about sort of this practice of achieving flow, now that practice could very well result in a kind of reflexive underestimation of one's skill set and sort of in parallel overestimation of the degree of difficulty of the challenge. And in Csikszentmihalyi's book, they kind of plot degree of difficulty of challenge on the y-axis and skills on the x-axis. And so when the person's sort of at the top, I guess the upper right quadrant, this is the graph, when the person's up here, that's sort of like, okay, the challenge is high, the y-axis, and the skills, though, it's at the outer edge of their skills, so that's optimal for flow. But if the challenge is high and the perceived skills feel on the lower end, that's what the resulting state there is often anxiety. And that may be a familiar state as survivors of narcissistic abuse have kind of a state they might find themselves in as they try to engage in activities that might be meaningful to them or set about working towards goals. And so my hope in bringing this sort of piece up in kind of what might influence one's perception of perceived challenge and their own skills to meet that challenge is to kind of like illuminate, hopefully, that yes, this can be part of something that is in play when we go about trying to achieve a state of flow in the aftermath of narcissistic abuse, and that as that awareness is sort of there, that hopefully it can lend some transparency over time, where it doesn't necessarily have to derail the process of finding such goals and working towards them in a manner that can afford this state of flow. Because when there's just enough like wiggle room from these sort of beliefs to kind of get into doing the task, that the immersion in that task over time becomes its own reward, and I think really works to counteract the more sort of psychic entropy states that can result from these kinds of beliefs. Because the beliefs, I think, kind of work to sort of freeze the self. They sort of, don't want the self to be in motion, because that is what would have put them in danger. So there's a really good reason for that. But gradually and incrementally and gently over time, as that motion gets reintroduced in the form of, say, undertaking a goal and pursuing it, with all the fits and starts that might occur, that can, again, be really useful in, I think, the system learning it's now incrementally safe to do so and become its own reward. I think one feature of surviving narcissistic abuse that can be present is that it may feel easier to sort of work and concentrate and focus on tasks that seem or are more in the service of others or of one's job than of oneself. And I think there's like good news actually from the Csikszentmihalyi's research, is that what he found was that the states folks found themselves in terms of the ranking of the happiness afforded was certainly first finding one's own goal and really wanting to pursue that and achieving a state of flow in that. But that even in working towards goals that were sort of externally imposed, whether for the job or raising one's child or whatever, that still afforded more a sense of purpose and even moments of flow than what was the lowest rung on that ladder, which was sort of not working towards any goal. So it can sometimes feel as though, to be in pursuit of a goal that's sort of for others maybe feels robbing of one's own authenticity or right to do what is really true for oneself, or as though it's still ministering or doing everything for someone else and not for oneself. But I think one useful finding of all this is that even in the course of working for the other, the self can get strengthened in an important way, that there's something intrinsically beneficial to being in that process of working towards a goal, regardless of the sort of source of that goal, whether for oneself or someone else. So flow really is sort of a state of deep focus on what one is doing. And I think it makes a lot of good sense why that would feel, difficult to attain and maintain for survivors of narcissistic abuse potentially. Because, when we think about what was required to survive a narcissistic parent or partner, I think it can sort of boil down in some ways to one had to pay more attention to that person than to oneself. To do so would have constituted what the narcissistic person would regard as a failure to comply with their sense of entitlement to having their sort of artificial importance being reflected back at them, and suffering would ensue for the survivor. So, flow then is saying, no, you should really just, focus on what is immediate and in front of you. And that's just so at odds with this tactic of survival that was required. And so I guess I want to emphasize this because I think it can importantly inform how one might remain patient, gentle, and supportive with oneself as these states of flow maybe get interrupted with sort of flitting thoughts of what one should be doing elsewhere, or what have they not done as they're doing this task at hand. Because that, I think, really corresponds to what was required in navigating a kind of closeness of sorts with someone who's narcissistic. Survivors can know that sort of if you're in the presence of the narcissistic person, to be sort of heads down and focused on something that's meaningful to you and not like attendant to that person. I mean, that could have been this perceived as a supreme insult that would have resulted in tremendous payback, and just something that this one may have had to train one's system not to do, and to kind of continually interrupt oneself to see what was needed over there by the narcissistic individual. And lastly, in terms of considerations of trying to achieve flow in the post-math of narcissistic abuse, as I listed that state of, nature abhorring a vacuum and psychic entropy that happens when we're not sort of in process of working towards a goal for ourselves. If you've endured the tumult of narcissistic abuse in sort of a chronic way, having a state of rest or being at a state of rest where there isn't something to work towards can very well be a blessed and needed relief from that sort of constant strain that I think one can be under in having to survive narcissistic abuse. And so I think perhaps in terms of balancing, working towards flow states and what's required in recovery from narcissistic abuse is, cultivating an attitude of kind of, understanding that times of respite are still needed after kind of having to endure the chronic stress on our nervous system that can happen when trying to deal with narcissistic abuse. Because usually, the fight, flight, freeze, submit responses are evoked in narcissistic abuse while being met with tremendous invalidation and undermining that those responses are appropriate. And so that sort of like spiking or dousing of the nervous system and then having the kind of rug pulled out from under is saying like, you shouldn't be, your nervous system shouldn't be spiking or plummeting. It is tremendously straining. And so finding these lulls can be important sort of recalibrating moments for oneself. So, I guess I think that it's important to contextualize, the challenges that can be faced in finding flow after narcissistic abuse, and how, the way the flow concept is explained in Csikszentmihalyi's book, how it maybe can be tailored to not result in a survivor of this type of abuse feeling like they're doing it wrong, or there's something sort of, wrong with them that they're not able to kind of get into such a state of focus, but to sort of customize it so that both the recovery piece of narcissistic abuse can coexist with these strivings towards these kind of ordered states of consciousness that I think can really represent what is some of the purpose, at least, of recovering from narcissistic abuse, is sort of to feel, one of the ways we can feel in possession of ourselves is that we get to kind of direct ourselves towards goals and sustain efforts towards goals that are meaningful to us. Well, I hope today's video was of some help, and thank you everyone again for your continued support and engagement with this content and with each other. It's just, again, always so heartening to read those comments. And I look forward to posting again next week, Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.